All right, it is time for skin weights, folks. This is a fairly tedious process, but it's very useful to know how to do. You're going to be understanding some of the different values that's going on here, and as we bind our actual mesh to the skeleton, we can start to actually have our controls work, right? Because right now, all of our controls do is they just move the bones underneath, which is fine and dandy, but we're here to rig, so we want to make sure that this is driving our girl's motion. So we'll bind the skin to this. We'll take a look at some different techniques that we can use to, alter this and make our result a little bit more pleasurable. And we'll look at painting weights and what that process looks like and how we can use that to fix some of the issues that might crop up on our rig. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll actually pull up these notes. Again, you should be able to find this girl on Blackboard. So if you're not caught up for whatever reason, you will still have this mesh. But if you have your own mesh, I encourage you to do so and use that. Let's see here. And all right, so yeah, everything's all right. So let's go ahead and get started. So binding a skeleton to a mesh is pretty easy, right? Let's grab the geometry first by left clicking on it. Again, make sure that it's unrestricted. So if over here in the display layer, the R is on and you can't grab it, that's because you've restricted the geometry. So I'll make sure that it's unrestricted. Grab my mesh, hold down Shift, and just click on the root. I'm not selecting hierarchy or anything. I'm just clicking on the root of my girl. So let's go ahead and bind our skin. And with your menu set to rigging, right? Not modeling or animation. It's not going to give us what we want. We set up to rigging and go up to skin, bind skin. And I'm just going to reset my settings, but these settings should be the same for you by default. You can pause and take a look at that to make sure it's okay, but it should be fine. I'll hit apply and close, and now my skeleton has turned a rainbow color. Wonderful. You can tell that it worked because, again, the skeleton was colorized. And I even think that was a... Yeah, colorized skeleton is also an option. So if you don't like it, you can tick it off, but I think it's a good way to visually confirm that my skin by skin worked. And before I go any further, I'm also going to unsmooth the model so we can look at some of the deformations a little more clearly. So I'll select my girl and hit 1 on the keyboard. I'll also do this because apparently Maya will sometimes crash if you alternate between smooth and unsmooth while you're working on skinning. So it shouldn't happen on 23. That was an older issue, but it's also something we want to be conscious of because sometimes this program's a little unstable. But now I'm bound, right? Let's even try some of our controls. I'll grab my root control that we have parented up, my move tool, and drag it back and forth. And, save for the eyeballs, she's actually moving around. Same with these up here. Now we can start to begin to pose her and animate our girl. So maybe we need to do some changes here, right? Because now that I look at this deformation, that doesn't look right. I'll undo a little bit to get her back upright. And something I also noticed is that maybe there's some weird bends happening in her thigh. And I'll grab her arm and move it, right? And now it's impacting like her rib cage and her underarm a little bit. And now let's maybe move one of these legs. And as I move this forward and backwards, you'll notice that my left leg is deforming and moving in the same direction as the right leg. So Maya does its best to guess how things should be skinned up, but some of the vertex weights, as they are called, are incorrect, right? Because if I'm moving my right thigh backwards, the flesh on my leg doesn't peel back with it, right? These are two separate entities, and that's not a very realistic deformation, and it's also buggy. So we want to go ahead and find some different ways to fix that. And another place that we might see this is on the fingers. So I move my middle finger. You can see that on my index and my ring, they're also moving with it. So that's because our vertex weights are wrong. So let's find a way to fix our vertex weights. We'll do that with the component editor. For the time being, I'll hide my joints, or even better, I might just select the girl and solo her out. Hop over to my front viewport and do the same. And we want to take a look at those vertex weights. So again, with my mesh selected, I'll hold down right click. I'll go to vertex. There is paint weights tool, but we'll look at that in just a little bit. And I want to change to vertex. Now all the different vertices are colored based off of how things are skinned up. And I know that they're wrong on my left leg here, so why don't we go ahead and grab all of those. You can drag select a box to grab everything and start to sort of go in there, but I prefer to use the lasso select tool. I mean, you could also use paint selection, I guess, if you really wanted to. But I'm just going to use the lasso because it's pretty accurate and I can get a good result quickly. So let's go ahead and click in here. I want to grab like up around her hip-ish, then come down. And because of that lasso tool, I'm not going to grab anything on the other side. Now that we have our vertices selected, let's look at those weights. So I'll go up to the Windows. We're going to open the component editor. I'm going to go up to Windows, down to General Editors, and over to Component Editor. So again, it's in the middle of like the second submenu under Windows, General Editors, Component Editor. Now, we're getting some weird stuff. Your component editor probably doesn't look like mine. What you're looking for are the smooth skins up here. So not rigid skins or blend shape deformers or whatever else it might be on. We're looking for the smooth skins tab. If you see it, we'll get a huge list of information. And I'll sort of break down what's going on here. Each vertex has its own weight data stored in it, and they all add up to a total of 1. So a total of 100% influence split between all of these different bones. And all those different bones that are influencing it are listed up here on the topmost row. So I'll maybe make this a little bit smaller so I can go to my viewport. I have my left leg selected, right? So my left leg and maybe a little bit of my left hip. But looking at our list, there's RT ankle, there's RT ball, there's RT hip, all the way over to RT toe. That is not necessarily what we want, right? Because this is on the left side of our body. We can know without a shadow of a doubt that this needs to be, or we don't need any influence from the RT bones, right? So we can get rid of those by just zeroing them out. In order to do so, you just want to grab the first box here in the upper left corner, right? So I want to grab ankle, knee, and toe. I don't want to grab them this way. I don't think this method always works. So I just want to click here in this box. Again, this is the topmost and leftmost data bank. RT ankle, I don't want that there, all the way over to RT toe. And again, with that selected, I'm just going to grab my scroll bar and go all the way to the bottom. Again, we can see some of those values in here, right? They're not necessarily 0, and that's going to mess us up. So I'm going to instead hold down Shift on my keyboard. So again, I had that selected way back up top, and I'm going to hold down Shift and left click on the very last bottom right data bank. I can grab a huge swath of all these different vertex weights. I can just type in 0 on my keyboard and hit enter. And now it's all gone. So I'll go ahead and right click and go back to object mode. And I'll unsolo my girl in this viewport. And now these vertices will not have any influence from the right leg, right? So now if I move this back, none of that leg is pulling back with it. And I will note that it's happening on the other side, but much like with our other tactics in rigging, we only need to do this for the left side because we're going to be able to mirror them over. So I'll practice that again on the fingers, and then we'll go ahead and move to some paint weights, and I can explain to you what's going on there. So I'll hide my joints for now. And we can use that similar tactic that when we were laying out our joints on our fingers, we can also use that to grab some of the selections of the vertices in our hand. So I'll right click and I'll go to face. I'll try to grab towards the fingertip, and I'll hit F as in find on my keyboard, and I'll just get my camera to move around it. So let's do what we did before, where we grab one face, hold down Shift, and grab the second face of the fingertip. And we're going to grow our selection, right? So we want to hold down Shift and then the period key to grow this up. And that's looking good. So if we go over to our component editor right now, there's nothing in smooth skins, right? This is a little F over here. It's not VTX. These are faces that we have. And those do not hold vertex weight because faces aren't vertices. So we can convert our selection by holding down Control or Command if you're on a Mac, and then hit the F9 key. And that allows you to change your selection from everything that the faces were highlighted to all the vertices that those faces were touching. And if for whatever reason that doesn't work for you, you can also just go in here, grab a vertex, and hold Shift, sort of grab around the fingertip, and also use a, oops. I just want to grab just the fingertip, right? I grabbed a little bit further up. But we can also grow our selection here. So we can hold down shift and use period to grow this. And now that we have these vertices selected, we can hop back into the component editor and see what's going on. I think the hand is a good example here. LT hand is a parent of our index bones, right? So we might want to leave these untouched. We'll probably adjust them later when we paint our weights, but we don't want to zero them out completely. That said, LT middle, LT ring, it looks like, and LT thumb have no business influencing my index finger. So we can do that same tactic again, right? So index ends here and middle begins here. I'm going to grab the top leftmost data bank in that selection, scroll down to the bottom, hold down shift, and it ends at thumb. So I'll grab everything in between there. So we have a huge amount of vertices selected, and we can zero out that weight. So now, the only thing that has influence on our index finger is the hand, and then our 4 index finger bones, which is exactly what we want. So I go back to object mode, toggle this on, and move my middle finger. Before, right, it was pulling our index finger back, and it still is with our ring finger, but now my index finger is untouched. And same goes if I try to move the thumb, and honestly, that's pretty good deformation on the thumb. It's not messing with much else. I might keep that. I don't think I need to paint that, so that turned out well. But what I'll do is I'll turn off my joints again. I'll repeat this process for the rest of the hand. And this process should be familiar to you by now. Again, we used it to lay out our bones. So I'll reiterate it once more, and then we'll start speeding through. So I want to change to faces mode. Shift select the 2 fingertip faces, grow my selection with shift and period key. Grab sort of up what we wanted to preview when we were laying out our bones before. Hit Control F9 on our keyboard to convert that selection, and let's start picking this apart. So it's the middle finger. We don't need index influences here. I will say something worth noting is that I might have grown my selection a little bit too much, because now these vertices selected are going into my index. So I might hit Shift, comma, or the less than sign to shrink that down a little bit. So we still do have some index finger influences on our middle finger, as well as I'd reckon some rings as well. So let's go ahead and zero those out. And again, LT hand is a parent of this joint, and generally speaking, if there's a parent of the joint, it's okay to leave those influences. We can tweak them with painting weights later, like I said, but we don't want to zero them out completely. So I'll go up here to the upper left, hold down, or go down to the bottom, hold down shift, again grabbing all of my index, because this is now my middle finger, zero them out, and they vanished. Let's repeat that for the ring finger. Cool. And I'll keep trucking. I'll just repeat this by grabbing the vertices this time and start growing my selection for my ring finger. I mean, maybe that's too much. Maybe I just want to deselect it by holding down shift and clicking. That's also valid. Same on this side. And keep going. So yeah, I'm gonna speed up through this. So I've done this a couple times. Should be familiar. So I'll just blaze through and see you on the other side. All right, now that's done. I'll just go back in here and double check and make sure everything is separated and moving okay. And I can repeat this process for the rest of the body, right? So I might be grabbing pretty much everything on the left side. Like if I really want to, I can go in here, maybe grab a lot of my arm, the lasso tool, and look for anything that says RT here, which it looks like it doesn't, so that's good. And probably the further up I go, like if I go into this clavicle area or where the pectoral is, I might start to see some RT crop up, but this is nebulous enough that I'm okay leaving it, since it might make sense for the right side to have like a little bit of influence over those. So use discretion in your knowledge of anatomy to sort of suss that out and figure it out. But that is what the process of using the component editor to reset our vertex weights looks like. So now let's paint some weights. I'll right click and go back to object mode just so I can get things set up. And to get access to our paint weights tool, you need to either change your shelf to rigging and look for the paint weights tool. It's this second little icon, which looks like a paintbrush instead of or in front of a bunch of squares or vertices. You can also go up to skin and down to paint skin weights. And cool. With my mesh selected, I activated that tool and we can already see something going on here. And yours probably looks different from mine. It might be black and white by default. I'll show you how to change that color here in just a moment. But now we're able to paint some weights. If I'm clicking and dragging, it doesn't look like I'm doing anything. So we need to open our tool options and use those to doodle around and see what's going on. So I'll go over here. Since I'm using my paint weights tool, I can go to the options by just double clicking there. But you can also get to the options by double clicking that same toolbar up in your rigging shelf, or going up to skin, down to paint skin weights, and accessing the options box. So now we have a lot going on here. Let's explore what's going on. So in this first pane, we have a list of all of our bones. Right now we have root selected. I can change which influence I'm editing by clicking on these bones. Right, so notice that if I go like to LT ankle, I have a lot of weight near where that ankle bone is. Knee does something similar, all the way up to the midsection, right? So I'm going to select LT toe for our demonstration. In terms of the actual display, yours might be black and white, and that's just, if I scroll down and go to the gradient option, you can choose to use a color ramp or not use a color ramp. So now it's just black and white versus colored out. And I'll keep it on black and white just for now. Again, this is a display option. This doesn't affect the mechanics of how your skin weights behave, just how you see them and how you perceive them. So use the option that works best for you and makes the most sense. Going back up here, there are a couple of different modes. There's paint, select, and paint select. We're not going to use select and paint select for this, really. Let's mostly stick with paint. And now we want to look at our paint operations underneath select geometry. So we have replace, add, scale, and smooth. So we'll first take a look at replace. I will discourage you from using this too much, and do notice that after I clicked on replace off of smooth that some of these values came alive, but I do want to discourage replace because it's pretty ham-fisted and brute force of a tool that again replaces the values of these vertex weights with whatever you choose here in this value. Again, like with our vertex values, right? This goes from 0 to 1. So 1 is like the 100% vertex weights, just like in our component editor. And the lower it is, the less influence the bone has over that particular vertex. So I'll show what replace looks like. I'll crank up my value to something very high. So once I start drawing on here, it'll be all white. Yep. And I'm not really able to, like layer on anything. It's just replacing my stroke with something that's all white. So if you really want to get cheeky about it, you can instead replace with a value of 0 and sort of use that as an eraser. So, I'm working on my LT toe. Maybe I don't want it to go back this far. So that might be one use of replace. You can use this if you would like. However, I'm going to discourage that because our other tools will work better. Next is add. Add is probably what we're going to be using the most in conjunction with smooth. So I'll tick on add and let's see what it looks like. Right now it's not going to do anything because my value is set to 0. So I want to change this value bar again, drag it. No, I'll just key in 0.15. So something pretty small and pretty tame. Now as I paint, right, you can see it's light gray. I'm just clicking and holding once. If I release and click again, it will now start to get thicker and thicker and thicker and brighter as I do multiple strokes. So this allows us to add some extra nuance to our paint weights, right? So I'm going to use this add tool to paint on my toes. So I'm just going to start clicking and going in. Because I have the toe bone here selected, I want to have the most influence over my toes. So I'm just going to keep clicking and sort of petting and stroking so my toes are bright white. And something else worth noticing, we'll work with this a little bit later too, is the actual size of your brush. Over in our tool settings that we've kept open, and again, I want to keep these tool settings open. I'm going to live in this menu. We scroll down to the stroke and twirl that down. We also have a radius that we can key in for radius U. You don't want to use L. Let's just adjust the U slider. So I'll maybe reduce this to 0.6. So now this is a little bit smaller and I can get in a little more fine with my particular painting. So I'm brightening these toes up. Again, if you want to toggle on the color ramp, you can feel free to do so. It just adds more colors in between, right? So black is still no influence and white is 100% influence. It just adds some colors in between if the gray gradient just isn't doing it for you. So again, I'm just going to come in here, I'm going to paint those. And this is a pretty harsh, like white to blue, right? So maybe I want to go even further up just a little bit and start painting in a little bit of fall off. So I'm just going to click along these and put a stroke in. And it's worth noting that you want to do these operations along edges and vertices. It doesn't seem to be as effective if you click on the faces, right? Because, well, a face is not a vertex. There's no vertex weight. So work on like petting alongside these edges and vertices and look how they change to get the best results. You can see in here that like the side of my toe needs some work. So I kind of want to have my toes painted to be like this, right? But maybe this is a little harsh. Maybe this red is a little too intense for the influence it should have over the region. So let's take a look at the smooth tool. Once I click this on, notice that my value has gone away because the smooth doesn't necessarily have its own value. It just does its best to average between the vertices around it based on your radius and as you sort of pet and stroke around. So if I do this, right, now it's starting to smooth it out a little bit, especially as I bring it down lower. It's trying to make that a much more smooth fall off. I'm losing some of the influence at the very edge of my toes, but I gained it up here because there's high influence. So that is delightful. Smooth really helps you get these looking a lot better without them being harsh. And we'll test our bones by bending them and using keyframes to set some different positions. And we can instead look at how smooth can be helpful for us to make those deformations more realistic. There is also this big button here that says flood, which, as the name would imply, floods the mesh with that operation that you're doing. So if I hit smooth, it floods everything. It does smooth. Do notice that everything in here is less harsh, but after I use the flood operation, it smooths things out. You can also use smooth with, or flood with add, but keep in mind when I do this, now I've added that to the entire geometry. So now like the head and the face is bound to the influence of the foot, so you want to avoid using add flood as much as possible. But smooth flood, feel free to use this. I wouldn't say spam click it, right? Because now I can start to change and alter this a little too much. So use this judiciously, use your judgment when you're using smooth flood, but it's a great way to, in an overarching fashion, get things smoothed out. And I'm missing some weight here, so I'll hit flood, and I like how that looks. So it's all fine and dandy. We're going to sort of start small and work our way up, right? That's why I grab the toe. If I grab the ball, I can start painting on weights here, too. But let's look at a way to test these deformations and see how we can alter that to our advantage. So I'll leave my paint weights tool for a moment, and I'll grab my rotate tool. I will turn on my joints again so I can grab them. And if you're having difficulty seeing the joints, you can also hide your girl's geometry and select them that way. This is also maybe where you might want to use Alt-B on your keyboard to change the background in Maya, just so you have better contrast. And I think black works great here, so let's use that. So I'm going to grab the ball with my foot, and I'm just going to rotate it up. I'm going to grab an LT ball and rotate it up. Let's go to our girl's geo layer. We're actually getting a really nice bend in there. Wow. So there's some things that we need to fix, of course, but that looks great. Wow. I got lucky here. So actually I'll redo that and just zero this out. And I'll also do the same with the ankle. So let's talk about setting some keyframes and why that's useful. So I'll set a keyframe for probably not the toes. The toes are fine. Maybe need a little bit of work, but I'll grab it for the ball first. Hit S on frame 0, scroll forward in time, and rotate it to a test position, hit S again. So we can test those deformations and begin to paint on our model without, having to switch back to our rotate tool, turn on or off our layers, and, alternate between that. We can instead just scrub back and forth through the timeline to look at how our deformations behave at different angles. So after I set that keyframe for the ball, I'll wait a little bit on the timeline, but I'll also set it for the ankle. And by default, it's probably going to get a little weird in here. So scoot forward, the ankle up. It's still actually pretty good, which is good news. It actually looks like a pretty realistic deformation. And we can scrub through and we can look at how things behave. So it's starting to impact in a little bit up here. Maybe I need to work on that for my ankle. So I'll hide my joints. Again, now that I have that on the timeline, I can get those away so I can just work on the mesh. I'll highlight the mesh and go back to my paint weights tool. So highlight the mesh, change the paint weights, double click it to bring the tool settings back, and we start working our way up. And again, I got quite fortunate here, but there are some things that I saw that I want to clean up. So we'll take a look at that process. Notice that on my ball, right, it is blue all the way up here, so there's a little bit of influence. And as I scrub forward in time, as the ball raises up, I'm also having some stuff back in the ankle move around as well. So you could try and use replace with 0, but what I'm going to encourage you to do is to just instead grab the ankle and add some more influence. Because again, it's getting a little green back here, and it's getting closer to blue, so I know it needs more influence from other parts. And LT&E, I will work on this in here, but we're looking for these smooth gradients, and they'll help us bend better. But as I mentioned before, some stuff down here is moving. That folds down. So the ball probably shouldn't have power over that. And I'll turn off my grid just to see. Point being is that if we, instead of trying to replace 0 on the ball and just use some add with a low value, we still take those values away from the ball. We're just reallocating them elsewhere on the mesh. So notice as I begin to paint in here, you can see that my vertices are sort of scooting in a little bit. And especially for the bottom here, I want to have the ankle have a lot of influence in this area. It's another technique we want to be cognizant of is that as we're painting along these edges, we can see how things deform. So pay attention to your edge flow, and if things start to look a little weird or get out of place, that might be an indicator that you need to go in there and fix your weights. And this is pretty harsh, so I'm trying to do my best to smooth this out. I'll go in with smooth, grab it, and kind of work on that a little bit. And maybe go back to add some influence here, because again, this is the ankle. I want it to have strong influence over here. And if I go over here, right, we can start to see my ball loses some influence, and it's more driven to the ankle's rotation. There we go. Here we go. This is a bug that I wanted to see. So I scrub forward in time right quick, and we can see that this is jutting out pretty severely. That's that loss of edge flow. Probably because there's a lot of influence from the ankle bone here, but very quickly, further up the mesh, you lose that influence. So, in this instance, I would go in here and I'd start to paint my add tool, and now it's starting to get that back out. Again, things in here are getting a little weird, so I might use smooth to help get my deformation out a little bit. But I honestly think since this is the ankle, that it needs to have a lot more influence up there. But to start things out, I'll go ahead and flood smooth just to smooth all of this out. So again, I have my smooth selected, and I'll hit the flood button. And it smooths things out a little bit for us. I might go in with add and start to be careful, right? I don't want to mess up my deformations too much, but I'm getting sort of this nice little almost like accordion crinkle. So if I start to paint in here, I'm going to lose it, but it's not really impacting on itself, but the skin or the flesh is still distorting in a way that makes sense. So I just want to go through and happy little tree style to start to paint these weights in. Going through with smooth to make sure this gradient stays soft. You know, as I smooth this out, I'm actually losing a little bit of influence, but that's okay. And this is actually really good deformation. You may or may not get as lucky as me, and I'll show further up the model where we want to definitely work on painting our weights more. But you want to start to noodle around with this, see what looks best and what works well. Maybe you want to smooth this out in here because I think this is a little intense. So now that curve makes a little more sense. Cool. So let's go up to our knee, and I'm going to show a problem that a lot of riggers run into early on, especially when it comes to painting weights, and that is the problem of noodles. I'll turn on my joints on the display layer, select this, I'll rotate my leg back. Alright, here we go. And actually, before I go too much further, I'm going to delete the keyframes on these. I even fell into that trap, right? So if I leave those on and I work on my rig for a while, these keyframes might mess me up later, so I'm just going to go ahead and kill them now. So let's grab them by selecting everything, right-clicking, and breaking connections. Hopefully that is pretty standard by now. You're getting used to that. Again, I want to right-click and break connections. So now nothing else is moving. Let's instead set a keyframe for the knee. S on frame 0, scoot forward, bend it up, hit S. So, something that we're seeing in here is a noodle. This looks like a macaroni elbow. We do not need macaroni elbows in our flesh, right? If you look at your knee and bend it back, the flesh squishes up against each other. It doesn't impact in like this. So it's not really a realistic deformation. Again, this is where we can see our keyframes come into play, right? Because a little bit of bend like this looks mostly fine, but as we squish up in here, this is not okay. So let's paint some weights in here to get that fixed. Ooh, and this is a good example to also look at something. So before I paint the weights in on the legs, let's look at our toes. Getting weird. There are a couple of these vertices that seem to have lost that edge flow. So we can either paint that to fix it, or because I know they're so wrong, I can also go into the component editor, right? So I can right click and go to vertices or to vertex selection and go back in. Select these really, really strange vertices. There's even some like tearing going on in here. Like this isn't quite what I'm looking for in terms of deformations. So let's go back to Windows, General Editors, Component Editors. Yeah, and these, for whatever reason, have some decent influence from the RT ball and toe. So I'll zero those out. So we can bounce back and forth. Now that looks a lot better too. We can bounce back and forth between our component editor and paint weights to get things looking a lot better. So this is where the process begins to get a little tedious, right? You'll have to bounce back and forth and work your way up on painting. But for now, let's fix that noodle knee. So I'll unhide my joints layer. Since I need to be working on how the knee bends, right? I'm still on my ankle. I'll hop back into the tool settings and grab my LT knee. And I'll grab add as well. And I'll scroll down and increase the radius of my brush back to 1. Because it's a little bit bigger back here. I want to work a little bit bigger. Again, we want the flesh to squish together. So as we begin to paint this, more influence, now it's getting a lot closer to it in here. And this is also the benefit of our keyframes, is that this might be a little too much, or it's a deformation that I want, but I can't get in here without painting back on the mesh. So I'll scrub back in time to add my influence here now and see how that looks as we come up against it. There we go. So the faces are hitting each other a little bit. I think I need some smoothing in here. But you do notice that I've no longer have that macaroni elbow. The flesh is squishing a little bit more realistically. Let's smooth this out. maybe just to dial that back a little bit. And of course, if I'm having difficulty, you can always flood smooth to see what happens. I think that's okay-ish. And I'll go ahead and paint in some add because like this is the knee, right? And it needs to be controlling the calf. There's no reason for this not to be white because as I paint this, you'll notice my edges start to pop up a little bit. You know, they're coming back into place as we give all the influence over to the knee bone. And depending on what you're using, right, they may not necessarily need to be all white. And if you're using the color ramp especially, it's a little more difficult to tell. Or you're not using the color ramp, rather. It's a lot more difficult to tell what's doing what. But that is actually pretty good. So now we're getting these nice tight bends. This is where you want to start going in and refining a little bit. Maybe this vertex looks like it's misbehaving a little bit, so scoot back, keep an eye on where it is, paint my weights, try my color ramp because I really do like the color ramp a little bit better. Maybe smooth it out, but not too much. So this is really where we need to spend a lot of time. There's a lot of back and forth on what looks good and what doesn't look good. I'm okay with that for now. I'll make sure that I save my progress, as always. Maybe like girl skinned, girl weights 2. An example we were working on in class before. Now we go back and forth. So that is the basic process of skin weights. I, of course, can go through and begin to refine this a little bit. I might, in the second part of this, go over in like time lapse, maybe what that looks like, because it will take a while, and I don't want you to just sit here in silence while I painstakingly paint weights for an hour. But again, just showing that sort of process that I use. Maybe scoot forward in time, set a key, move this up so I can work on my thigh. So obviously there's some weird impacting going in here. So maybe I need to grab this, paint my weights, and bring my tool menu back. So LT hip, we can see what has influence, and I don't think it should have influence up here. So I can even, close some of these swirl downs and find the spine. And begin to paint on a little more add so we can give it more influence here. So we can sort of lose that impacting issue. So again, this is spine 1 in here. The root obviously is what's around here. And maybe I need to give that a little more control over the area as well. And in doing so, we're sort of taking that away from the thigh. And again, you can tell things start to look weird because I'm starting to see these vertices that sort of stick out. So that lets me know that I need to fix that by painting. Again, I'm losing that edge flow. Maybe go around here. Maybe want to step back to the hip and start working on the buttocks a little bit. Obviously the hip would have more influence here. Notice how my edges are changing and deforming as I paint through. So on and so forth. Of course, again, if you're struggling with this, and this definitely isn't looking good, you can always change to smooth and flood smooth. So that's looking a little bit better. It's looking a lot better, actually. And again, there's some tearing that I need to go through and refine, but we're looking for that really nice tight bend, right? No noodles, and we're trying to get sort of those creases that happen between the different points of flexion and extension on our body, and that's what we want to be looking for. So in the next part, I'll probably speed through doing all of these and working on mirroring it over. And we'll look at some different techniques for the eye and use what we already know to do the jaw. So that's all I have for you at this time. I hope this was helpful. Good luck. I know it can be kind of difficult and kind of tedious. There's no perfect way to do it, but just spend as much time as you are comfortable with before you stress yourself out and pace yourself. And if you get a little frustrated, maybe take a break, get some water, take a walk, and come back with a clear head. So that said, I hope this was useful, and I'll get to you in the next video.